We now have 100% of the precincts reporting in from the Nevada caucus, and as a result, we have a pretty good idea on how many of the 36 pledged delegates are going to be going to each candidate. So first, I'm going to fill out the pledged delegate tracker so we can see exactly where we are, and then after that, I want to do a bit more of a discussion explaining exactly what happened in Nevada and why it was so beneficial for Bernie Sanders. So starting off here, Joe Biden, he was able to grab 9 of the 36. Bernie Sanders picks up 24. He gets the lion's share of those pledged delegates. Bloomberg, 0. Warren, 0. Pete was able to grab 3. Tom Steyer, 0. And then Amy Klobuchar, 0. Kind of interesting. Of these upper-tier Democratic hopefuls, the only 2 that haven't received any pledged delegates yet are the 2 billionaires, Michael Bloomberg, as well as Tom Steyer. And we can see after the first 3 races, Bernie has the most pledged delegates at 45. He's 2.26% of the way there to getting to the 1,991 you need to win on the first ballot at the convention. In second, you have Buttigieg, who's at 25, so 20 pledged delegates back of Sanders. And then you have Biden at 15, Warren at 8, Klobuchar at 7, and then, of course, Steyer and Bloomberg each at 0. So of the 36 pledged delegates, Sanders was able to get 67% of them, which is quite a bit more than the amount of vote that he was actually getting. So I'm going to go through and try to explain how this happened. So how was it possible that Sanders was able to get 67% of the pledged delegates, even though he had 47% or so of the number of delegates that were allocated to him across all precincts? So I'm going to go through this step by step. On the first alignment, this is the first choice that these individuals had when they came in to vote. When that was the case, Sanders was at around 34% of the popular vote on the first alignment. Biden was at about 17.5%, Buttigieg a little over 15%. So actually kind of interestingly, statewide, Buttigieg was able to get 15% on the first alignment and actually did even a little bit better than that on the final alignment, but it wasn't able to convert to enough delegates for him to actually get above that 15 percentage point threshold. So kind of a tough luck situation there for Mayor Pete. Elizabeth Warren, she was a little under 13% on the first alignment, and then Steyer and Klobuchar were between about 9 to 10%. So if you don't get above the 15 percentage point threshold at each caucus site, then your supporters have the ability to go behind other candidates on that final alignment. So when that happened, we can see the final alignment popular vote had Sanders a little bit above 40%, so he got a big gain in that instance. Joe Biden picked up a little bit. He was less than 19%. Buttigieg also picked up a little bit where he went up to 17.33. Elizabeth Warren dropped a little bit to 11.53. And then Klobuchar and Steyer, they had the most drop in that instance, which isn't a big surprise because they weren't able to reach that viability in many of the caucus sites. So you had Klobuchar go down to 7.26 and Steyer down to 4.06%. Now, these final alignment numbers are what are used to determine how many delegates at each site the candidates get, and then that number is used to decide how many pledged delegates the candidates end up getting. Kind of complicated, but it was very beneficial to Sanders because almost essentially across every single precinct he reached viability. He was able to add on to his numbers in the final alignment, and then each caucus site is given a certain amount of delegates that they divvy up based on the support that these respective candidates have in that final alignment. And this is another scenario that really benefited Sanders because then he jumps up to nearly 47% of those delegates that were divvied up. So this isn't a popular vote number. This is probably the number that you guys see more often than not because it's what's utilized to determine the pledged delegates that are divvied up among these candidates. But these are just essentially every single caucus site are given a certain amount of delegates to divvy up. And with those divvied up delegates, which is labeled as votes here, but really they're these state delegates, Sanders was able to get 6,788, Biden 2,927. And unfortunately for Buttigieg, statewide, he fell a little bit below that 15% number. So in terms of the state level pledged delegates, only 2 of the candidates divvied them up. That would have been Sanders and Biden. And then there's 4 different congressional districts. Sanders was able to get above the 15% threshold in all of the congressional districts. So he was a part of the candidates that divvied them up in those instances. Buttigieg was able to get above the threshold in a couple of the districts. So even though he wasn't able to get to 15% statewide. There were still specific districts where he was able to eclipse 15%. That's why he ends up getting 3 pledged delegates. You might ask, well, why did he get anything in the way of pledged delegates? Again, there was a couple of districts where he was able to get above 15% on this final delegate number, so that's why he was able to get something in the way of pledged delegates out of the state. But this 47% statewide was able to get Bernie Sanders 24 of the 36 pledged delegates. So Sanders ends up getting 67% of the pledged delegates in the state, despite only having 34% of the vote on the first ballot, a little over 40% on the final alignment, and then going up to nearly 47% in terms of how those state delegates were divvied up. And then that ended up converting into 67% of the pledged delegates statewide. I made a video about this a little while ago where I went over how Sanders could actually end up getting over 50% of the pledged delegates, even if he had less than 50% of the vote. This is a very clear example of that, especially when you have so many candidates running and they're splitting up the vote so many different ways. It's making it so not as many of these candidates are able to get above that 15 percentage point threshold number, which means they don't end up getting anything in the way of pledged delegates. We saw that in the state of Nevada from Bloomberg, Elizabeth Warren, Tom Steyer, as well as Klobuchar, and that was greatly beneficial to the Vermont senator. So again, it's an extremely complicated process, particularly for these caucuses. It's a bit more straightforward in the primary, where essentially they just use the first alignment. So if Nevada was a primary and not a caucus, then Sanders wouldn't have gotten as many delegates as he ended up grabbing from the state. So the next contest now that we're heading towards is going to be the South Carolina primary. They have 54 pledged delegates up for grabs, which is the most out of any of the early states. We'll see how everything plays out in that instance, but as soon as we get those final pledged delegate numbers out of the state of South Carolina, I'll be making another one of these videos updating you guys on exactly where the race is at. So I appreciate you stopping by. Consider subscribing for more and hope to see you back here for future videos.